The relay station at the edge of the Sol quarantine zone had been quiet for 847 years. Nobody worked there anymore. Nobody lived there. It ran on old power cells and older code, and its only job was to listen to a dead region of space and make sure nothing came out of it. Nothing ever did. So when the signal came through at 0300 station time, the automated system flagged it, logged it, and sent a copy to the nearest assembly communications hub. The system had no opinion about what it had received. It was a machine. It just passed the message along. It took 6 hours for a junior communications clerk named Dara to open the file. She was at the hub on Vethys Station, third moon of a gas giant in a system whose name most species shortened because the full version took 4 seconds to pronounce. Dara had been on duty for 9 hours. She had a cup of something warm going cold on her desk. She opened the file the way she opened every flagged transmission from the outer rim, expecting nothing. She read it once. She read it again. She put down her cup. The message was written in high assembly protocol. Not a translation. Not an approximation. The real thing, formal, correct, formatted to the exact standard that the assembly's founding documents required for official requests from member species. The grammar was perfect. The citations were correct. The routing codes matched the old human seat number, which had been archived as inactive for 1,000 years. The message was short. It asked for a seat at the next full assembly session. It cited Founding Charter Clause 7, subsection C. It gave a name for the species making the request. Human. Dara sat very still for a moment. Then she forwarded the message up the chain, marked it urgent, and went and stood in the corridor outside the communications room for a while because the room felt too small. The message reached Vale Coram 11 hours later. He was the senior archivist of the Galactic Assembly, which was a title that sounded more peaceful than it was. His job was to know everything the Assembly had ever done, said, decided, or buried. He was very old, even by the standards of his kind. He had seen 200 sessions. He had watched species rise and fall. He had filed the paperwork when humanity was declared extinct, 1,000 years ago, and he had been the only vote against the motion. He had kept that number in his head for a long time. 214 to 1. He carried it the way some people carry an old injury, not always painful, but always there. He read the message 3 times. Then he did something no one in his office had seen him do in 400 years. He laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was short and dry, and it came out of him like something that had been waiting a very long time for a door to open. His assistant, a young Vethian named Sewell, looked up from his desk with open alarm. Vale Coram did not explain. He forwarded the message to the full assembly coordination office, marked it highest priority, and attached a single note of his own: "This one is real." The assembly coordination office did not believe him at first. They ran verification checks on the signal's origin point. The signal had come from inside the quarantine zone, from deep inside it, from the direction of the old Sol system itself. The zone had been sealed after the declaration. No ship had gone in or out in 1,000 years, not officially, and the assembly's border monitors had never logged a breach. Whatever had sent the signal had never left. The coordination office called an emergency closed session within 18 hours. The debate was not calm. 3 species moved immediately to suppress the signal, to classify it, bury it, pretend it had not arrived. Their reasons were stated in legal language, but everyone in the room understood the actual reason. The human seat had been empty for 1,000 years. The resources from the Sol quarantine zone had been quietly redistributed. The political agreements that followed the Extinction Declaration had reshaped half the Assembly's power structure. One signal from a dead zone threatened all of it. The motion to suppress failed by 2 votes. Both votes against it were cast by species too small and too far from the center of Assembly politics to have anything to lose. Vale Coram cast his vote without speaking. The signal was allowed to stand. Meanwhile, at the edge of the quarantine zone, something had already moved. The border monitor on the assembly side of the zone was old hardware, functional, but built for a time when the zone was considered a formality. It logged the event with the flat accuracy of a machine that had no way to understand what it was recording. A vessel had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the zone's inner boundary. It had come from the Sol system's direction. It crossed the border without stopping, without requesting clearance, without acknowledging the automated challenge signals the monitor sent in 47 languages. It just came through. The monitor's sensors tried to classify the vessel. They could not find a matching hull design in any current database. The proportions were not standard. The engine signature was not standard. Even the material composition of the hull registered as something the sensors had no reference point for. The monitor eventually filed it under unknown, origin species unclassified, and sent the data to the Assembly Defense Office. The Defense Office sent it to 6 analysts. The 6 analysts spent the rest of that day trying to figure out what they were looking at. The vessel was large. Not the largest thing in assembly space. The assembly had ships that made planets feel modest, but large enough to carry a serious crew, a serious payload, or both. It ran with no weapons active. No shields raised. No defensive posture of any kind. It moved toward assembly central space at a speed that was fast but not aggressive, like something that had no reason to rush because it had already decided where it was going. One of the analysts flagged the lack of weapons as a concern. Not because it suggested weakness. Because it did not. A ship that flies into foreign space with no shields and no weapons either does not know what it is doing or does not need to worry about what anyone else might do. The analysts spent 2 more hours trying to decide which one applied. They could not agree. On the bridge of the vessel, Nora stood at the viewport and looked at assembly space opening up ahead of her. She had been born on a ship. She had grown up on ships and in tunnels and in pressurized habitats on worlds with too much gravity or not enough air. She had never seen Earth except in recordings made before the quarantine. She had a copy of one on a small device she kept in her coat pocket. She did not watch it often. Once a year, maybe. On the date the assembly had filed the Extinction Declaration. She watched it then, every year, and then she put it away and went back to work. She did not watch it now. She just looked ahead at the stars and the slow-growing shapes of assembly stations and traffic lanes and the enormous, ancient machinery of a civilization that had decided 1,000 years ago that her people were finished. Behind her, Eli was at the communications console. He was reviewing the message they had sent, the formal request, the cited clause, the careful language that had taken 6 months of committee work to draft and 3 more months to decide to send. They received it, the comms officer said. Good, Eli said. He did not sound excited. He did not sound nervous. He sounded the way a man sounds when something he planned a long time ago begins to move the way he planned it. Tell them we are on our way, Nora said, without turning from the viewport. Tell them to set a chair out. Nobody laughed. But the comms officer was smiling when she sent the message. The vessel kept moving. The assembly kept watching. In the coordination office, in the closed session, in the offices of 3 species whose economies had quietly grown fat on a dead zone's resources, everyone was trying to figure out what to do next. Vale Coram was not trying to figure out anything. He already knew. He went home. He made tea. He sat in his chair by the window that looked out over the assembly central ring, all that light and traffic and the hum of a civilization going about its business. He thought about a vote he had cast 1,000 years ago. He thought, 1. He drank his tea. He waited. The docking bay on Assembly Central Station could fit 12 standard vessels at once. On the day the human ship arrived, 11 of those spaces were empty. The assembly had cleared them all, which was either a gesture of respect or a precaution. Nobody said which. The bay itself was full of people. Every species that had a diplomatic presence on the station had sent someone. They stood in clusters near the observation rail, recording devices out, talking quietly in 6 dozen languages. Security personnel lined the walls. Assembly officials stood near the airlock in formal clothes, holding documents they had probably never expected to actually use. Vale Coram stood at the front, alone, with nothing in his hands. The ship had docked without any trouble. No contact issues, no clearance disputes. The human pilot had brought the vessel in with a precision that made the bay's traffic coordinator stop what she was doing and watch. The docking arm engaged. The pressure seals locked. The status board went green. And then nothing happened for 4 minutes. The crowd at the rail got restless. Cameras stayed on the airlock. Someone near the back coughed. One of the junior assembly officials leaned over to another and said something. The other one shook his head. Then the airlock opened. Eli walked out first. He was alone. No security, no aid, no one walking beside or behind him. He walked the way people walk when they are used to rooms paying attention to them, not performing it, just used to it. He was wearing dark clothes, formal without being ceremonial, cut in a style that borrowed something from old assembly diplomatic dress but adjusted it in ways that were too specific to be accidental. He looked like someone who had studied the rules before deciding which ones to bend. He stopped in front of Vale Coram. The crowd at the rail went quiet the way crowds go quiet when something important happens and everyone knows it at the same time. Eli spoke first. He spoke in high assembly protocol, the formal language of the assembly floor, precise and old, and his pronunciation was exact. Then, in the same breath, he switched into Vale Coram's native dialect. Not the standardized version. The regional one. The one with about 9 speakers left alive in the galaxy. Vale Coram went very still. "We have had a long time to study," Eli said. "We used it." Vale Coram said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in his own language, "You pronounce the third syllable wrong." Eli looked at him. "Slightly," Vale Coram added. Something moved in Eli's face that was not quite a smile. He nodded once, as if filing the correction away. Lena came through the airlock after that, and if Eli was controlled then Lena was the opposite, not loud, not embarrassing, but clearly someone who had been waiting her entire life for this room and was having some difficulty not showing it. She kept her face even but her eyes went everywhere. She catalogued things. Her head moved in small, quick tilts, like a bird that was also a linguist. Nobody else came through the airlock. The crowd at the rail had expected more. They looked at the open airlock and waited. It stayed empty. Nora did not come to the docking bay. This had been decided in advance, and it was the kind of decision that said something without saying anything. The formal greeting took an hour. Every attending official had a prepared statement. Eli listened to all of them with the same expression, present, patient, giving nothing away. When it was done, the Assembly's senior diplomatic coordinator announced that a full question session would begin in the main reception hall. The reception hall was large and bright and built for exactly this kind of event. Tables in a wide arc, translators at every station. The room filled up fast. The questions came in waves. Every species wanted to know the same thing, just worded differently. How had humans survived? Where had they been? What had they been doing? How large was their current population? What were their military capabilities? Were they a threat? That last question was not asked directly. It was dressed up in diplomatic language. But it was in every question, underneath. Eli answered none of them directly. He answered around them. He spoke clearly, he gave facts, he referenced dates and agreements and charter language, and when the session was over and the analysts went back to their offices to review the recordings, they found that they had been given a complete picture that contained almost no actual information. Like a painting of a door that looked open but was only paint. It took them 6 hours to realize this. Lena, during the same session, had found a junior aide from one of the smaller assembly species and had been talking to him in the corner for most of it. She was speaking his childhood regional dialect, not the official language of his species, the regional one, the one from the specific coastal territory where he had grown up. She knew it the way someone knows a thing they learned from documents and recordings and love, not from living inside it. The aide looked at her the way people look at something they cannot fully explain. She was delighted by this. She did not hide the delight, exactly. She just let it sit in the room while they talked about linguistics and the session continued around them. After the formal reception, Vale Coram walked Eli to his quarters. This was a deliberate breach of protocol, the archivist had no such official duty, and every watcher in the corridor noted it. No one said anything. They walked without speaking for a while. The station corridors were wide and quiet in this section, the light softer, the floors a deep gray. Their footsteps were the only sound. The vote was 214-1, Vale Coram said, when they reached the door. He did not explain which vote. He did not need to. Eli stopped. He looked at Vale Coram for a long moment, with the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have known a thing for a long time and have decided not to perform the knowing. "We know," he said. He went inside. The door closed. Vale Coram stood in the corridor. He had said what he said and he was not sure why, except that 1,000 years is a long time to carry a number, and the human had looked like someone who deserved to hear it said out loud rather than felt in the background of everything. He walked back through the station toward his own office. The corridors had more people in them now, the diplomatic traffic of the day's events, officials moving with the slightly elevated energy of people who had seen something they were still processing. He passed the docking bay observation window. The human ship was still there, lit from below by the bay's dock lights. It sat the way the whole situation sat, larger than expected, still and patient, not asking for anything it had not already arranged to receive. He kept walking. Nora had spent the afternoon walking through the assembly's commercial district. She went alone. No translator. No security. She bought nothing and touched nothing and moved through the crowds of alien faces and alien commerce without stopping, without asking, just watching. Crowds moved around her in the particular way that crowds move around someone they cannot read. There was nothing hostile in her. There was nothing soft either. She just moved, looked, and kept moving. She found the memorial wall near the station's transit hub. It was a long, pale surface, carved with dozens of species names and dates, species that had gone extinct, species that had withdrawn from the assembly, species that had simply stopped. Each name had a short notation below it. She found the human one. She read it twice. Photographed it. She did not say anything. She turned around and walked back toward the ship. On the way, she passed a food vendor selling something that smelled nothing like anything from home, and something that smelled a little like something that might have, once, in a version of the world that did not exist anymore. She kept walking. Back on the ship, she sat in her chair on the bridge and looked at the dock lights through the viewport. Lena came in after a while and sat in the chair next to her. "How was it?" Lena asked. "Bigger than I expected," Nora said. "The station?" Lena nodded. They sat with that for a minute. "They are afraid," Lena said. "Good," Nora said. She did not say it with satisfaction, exactly. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and has to be accounted for. The dock lights hummed. The station moved around them, full of noise and calculation and a 1,000-year-old assumption that was now, quietly, and without ceremony, coming undone. The assembly chamber was the largest room on Assembly Central Station, and possibly the largest room in this part of the galaxy. It was a wide, tiered bowl, hundreds of seats rising in rings from the central floor, every seat connected to a translation system, every species with a registered presence given a place somewhere in the arc. The ceiling was high enough that the light changed color before it reached the top rows. It had not been this full in 400 years. Standing room was gone by the time the session was called to order. People who had no official reason to be there had found reasons. The observation gallery, usually half empty, was packed. Journalists from 6 species were broadcasting. Analysts from a dozen governments had feeds running to offices across assembly space. Eli stood at the center floor and looked at all of it. He did not look nervous. He did not look impressed. He looked like a man who had stood in difficult rooms before and had learned that rooms do not actually do anything to you. Only what happens in them does. He was silent for a moment that lasted slightly too long to be comfortable. The chamber went quiet. Then he began to read. He read Founding Charter Clause 7, subsection C. The full text. Every word of it, in every official assembly language, in the correct order for formal floor presentation. He had memorized it. He did not look at notes. It took 40 minutes. The clause was not complicated. It said, in every language, the same thing: any founding member species had the right to reclaim its seat upon proof of continued existence. The assembly had written this into its founding documents because, at the time, they had believed it would never need to be used. Species that went extinct did not come back. That was the nature of extinction. The clause had been there for 1,000 years, unread, archived, technically active. Every assembly member in the chamber had agreed to be bound by it. When Eli finished reading, he set down the document, a physical copy, paper, made in the old way, and looked up at the chamber. "We exist," he said. "The clause is clear. We are here to collect." The opposition came in waves. The first wave was procedural. 3 species filed motions challenging the validity of the request on grounds of timeline. 1,000 years of absence, they argued, constituted de facto withdrawal from founding rights. The charter was silent on this specific point, and they intended to use that silence. Eli nodded toward Lena. She stepped to the secondary podium. She looked like someone who had been waiting her entire life to be correct about something in front of a large audience, and she was going to enjoy every second of it. She cited 43 assembly precedents. She cited the founding session transcripts. She cited a membership dispute from 400 years ago that had taken 11 sessions to resolve and had set a clear standard on exactly the question being raised. She did not raise her voice. She just kept citing things. Her voice had the pleasant, steady quality of someone who has done so much reading that being right has stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like weather. The procedural motions failed. The second wave was economic. 2 species with extraction operations inside the former human quarantine zone argued that reinstating the human seat would create legal complications for rights that had been granted and operating for centuries. They were careful not to say that those rights had been granted because humanity was declared unable to object. They did not need to say it. Everyone in the room understood. Eli addressed this himself. He did not raise his voice either. He pointed out that no extraction rights within the quarantine zone had ever been properly voted on by a full assembly session. They had been administrative decisions, made in the absence of the zone's actual owner. The charter, he noted, was also clear on this. There was a long silence after he said it. The third wave was political. A representative from one of the larger central species stood and gave a speech about stability, about the difficulty of reversing 1,000 years of settled arrangement, about the cost of disruption to systems that were working. She spoke for 20 minutes and every minute of it was technically accurate and entirely beside the point. When she finished, the chamber chair called a recess. 3 days. Time for consultation. Time for the assembly to decide what it actually wanted to do. What the assembly wanted, in the quiet of the recess, was to make the problem smaller. 3 senior representatives from the opposing bloc requested a private meeting with Eli the first evening of the recess. Off the record. No official log. Eli agreed. He brought Lena and no one else. They met in a small room near the administrative wing. The representatives were polite. They were experienced diplomats from ancient species with long memories for what worked and what didn't. They offered humanity observer status. A consultative seat. A formal advisory role with real access to information and real ability to influence decisions, without an actual vote on the floor. It was a good offer. It was face-saving for everyone. It let the Assembly's existing arrangements stay mostly intact. It gave humanity something. Just not the thing they had come for. Eli listened to the entire offer. He let them finish. He did not interrupt. When they were done, he was quiet for a moment. No, he said. They pushed. They reframed the offer. They added provisions. They pointed out the practical difficulties of full reinstatement, the complexity of integrating 1,000-year absent species into active governance, the time it would take. Eli did not move. He had a kind of stillness that did not feel like stubbornness. It felt more like stone, not resistant, exactly. Just there, and not going anywhere. We built the table, he said. We want our chair. He said it the same way he had said everything else. Flat. Even. Not angry, not triumphant. Just true. The meeting ended shortly after. Lena was quiet on the walk back to their quarters. She was thinking about something and the thinking showed on her face, which was not something she usually allowed. They were not expecting us to say no, she said. No, Eli said. They thought we would be grateful, she said. Eli thought about that for a moment. They thought we would be smaller than we are, he said. They have been thinking that for 1,000 years. It is the same mistake. Lena looked at him. The same mistake as declaring us extinct in the first place, she said. Yes. They walked in silence for a while after that. The second day of the recess, Nora requested access to the Assembly's public archive. The request was granted. She went alone, in the morning, before the station's commercial areas filled up. The archive was an enormous space, not digital, not remote. Physical storage on a scale that only a civilization with 1,000 years of records needs. She walked through it for 2 hours, looking at nothing specific, just looking. She found the section on extinct and withdrawn species. Found the human records. A whole row of shelving. Documents, recordings, the full transcript of the extinction session. She did not pull any of it out. She just stood in front of it and looked at how much space it took up. A whole row. 1,000 years of being a story that other people told about you. She went back to the ship. She did not say anything about where she had been. Nobody asked. The vote was called on the morning of the third day. Vale Coram filed his vote before the session chair finished reading the motion. His assistant asked if he wanted to review the final wording first. No, Vale Coram said. He had been ready for 1,000 years. The vote was still 3 hours away when the Assembly Coordination Office sent a formal notice to the human quarters. Before the session resumed, the full Assembly required a complete account of the human civilization, its current state, its population, its governance, and the specific events of the last 1,000 years. Not a summary. A full presentation. It was, technically, a requirement under the Reinstatement Clause. A species reclaiming its seat had to prove not just that it existed, but that it was still a functioning civilization by Assembly standards. Eli read the notice over breakfast. He looked at Lena. "How long do you need?" he said. "I have been ready for this since I was 12 years old," Lena said. "So, not long. 30 seconds, maybe." The presentation took 2 days. It was not what the Assembly expected. Nobody in the chamber said this directly, but it was visible in the way the room moved, the small shifts in posture, the adjustments of recording angles, the particular silence that settles over a group of people who are realizing that what they prepared for and what is actually happening are not the same thing. They had expected a survival story. A hard one, probably. 1,000 years of hiding and struggling and barely holding together, a people who had made it through the quarantine by the skin of their teeth, damaged and diminished, needing the Assembly now more than the Assembly needed them. What they got was a civilization that had spent 1,000 years becoming something the Assembly did not have a category for. Lena presented the science first, because she said the science was the easiest part to understand even if it was the hardest to believe. Without access to Assembly research, without the shared databases, the cooperative institutions, the established consensus of galactic scientific thinking, human science had not stalled. It had gone sideways. It had split into 17 different schools of thought, each working from different assumptions, each developing frameworks that contradicted the others. And then, over 4 centuries, those schools had collided, argued, borrowed, collapsed, and rebuilt until they arrived at something that was not any of the original 17 and was also not what the Assembly had been building toward. The Assembly's greatest minds had been working toward a unified field theory of fundamental physics for 2 millennia. They had been, by most estimates, 3 or 4 more centuries away from it. Humanity had filed the equivalent 300 years ago. The copy Lena put on the display was a translated version, simplified for the presentation. The chamber was very quiet during this part. Lena let the quiet sit for a moment. Then she moved to medicine. Without Assembly medical frameworks, and without the ethical codes those frameworks enforced, human biology had been modified in ways that the Assembly's founding agreements explicitly prohibited. Not in cruel ways. Not in ways that made them less than human. But in ways that crossed lines the Assembly had drawn based on concerns that had not felt as urgent when the choice was survive or don't. They were still human. They were human the way a river is still the same river after it has run through different ground for 1,000 years. The shape was different. The depth was different. What it could do was different. But it was the same water. 3 Assembly medical representatives asked questions during this section. Their questions were careful and specific and clearly designed to find something alarming in the data. They did not find it. Lena answered each one with the same patient precision she had used in the procedural session, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady and correct. The governance section came last, and this was the part that Eli handled himself, because Lena had told him it would be better if she were not the one speaking when certain things were said. The human government that existed now had not come from any of the governments that existed before the quarantine. Those had broken down in the first 2 centuries, not violently, or not only violently, but because people locked in a sealed zone with limited resources and no outside help eventually stop performing the political systems they inherited and start building the ones they actually need. What they had built was not something Eli could summarize in a single word. He spent a long time trying to find the closest assembly analogy and eventually gave up and described it directly. It made decisions by a consensus process that ran continuously, at every level, in real time. It had no central authority. It had structures that looked like authority but functioned as coordination tools. It had been tested by 1,000 years of the specific pressure that comes from being alone, being sealed in, and having no one to appeal to when things went wrong. It had held together. One of the opposing bloc representatives leaned forward at this point and asked the question that had been sitting under everything since the first session. "Why did you not contact us sooner?" she said. Her voice was tight, controlled. "If you had developed all of this, if you were capable of all of this, why wait 1,000 years? Why now?" The chamber was very still. Eli looked at her. He took his time. "We wanted to be ready," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not explain what ready meant. He moved on to the next point of the presentation. But Lena, standing at the side of the floor, looked at her document display for a long moment and then looked at the floor. She knew what ready meant. She had grown up knowing what it meant. Ready meant not just capable. It meant unable to be dismissed. It meant coming through that door in a way that left no room for the world to look at them the way it had looked at them before. It meant never again. She kept her face even. The session continued. The final vote came at the end of the second day of presentation. Vale Quorum had already filed. When the session chair called the tally, it ran slowly, each member's vote logged and broadcast live to 63 inhabited systems. 196 for reinstatement. 19 against. 1 abstention. The chamber did not erupt. It was not that kind of quiet, not the tense quiet of waiting, not the held breath quiet of suspense. It was the quiet that comes after something lands that has been falling for a very long time. The kind of quiet that is almost physical. Almost like something changing the air pressure in a room. Eli stood in the center of the floor. His face did not change. Lena, at the side, covered her mouth with one hand for exactly 2 seconds. Then she took her hand down. She looked at the display. She looked at the number. She looked at the ceiling. She had been 12 years old when she first read the Extinction Declaration in the archive tunnels on a world with 6 names, in a habitat that smelled like recycled air and old plastic. She had read it the way you read something you already know is wrong, not sad, not angry, just clear about it in a way that settles into your bones and stays there. The number on the display was 196. She breathed once, deeply, and turned back to the room. Nora was in the observation gallery. She had been there for the full 2 days. She had not come to the floor. She sat in the back corner of the gallery, slightly apart from everyone around her, and watched. When the tally finished, she looked at it for a long time. Then she looked out the chamber's high windows at the station beyond, all that traffic, all that light, all those species going about their lives in a galaxy that had, for 1,000 years, been arranged around the assumption that her people were gone. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the small device she carried. The recording of Earth, made before the quarantine. She did not play it. She just held it in her hand for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket. She stood up. She left the gallery. She went to find Eli. The ceremony was pulled from an archive that had not been opened in 1,000 years. The Assembly's protocol office had to request special access to retrieve it. The file was stored in a section labeled Foundational, and foundational materials required 3 senior signatures to unlock. This took most of the morning. Nobody had expected to need it again. It was a long ceremony. It had been written for the founding of the Assembly, when the original member species had taken their seats for the first time, and it had the particular character of things built for a moment that felt, at the time, like the beginning of everything. 7 ritual elements. 3 formal recitations. A registration process that required physical documentation, stamped in the old way. Eli sat through all of it without moving more than necessary. He was good at waiting. He had grown up around people who were good at waiting, people who had learned, over generations, that patience was not a passive thing. It was something you built and maintained and chose, every day, against the pull of everything else. He sat in the formal chair placed for him on the floor and he listened to the ceremony and he let it move at the speed it moved. Lena was at the side of the floor, officially registered as part of the human delegation. She was holding a document she had been given that morning, a translated copy of the ceremony text, and she was reading along as the session chair spoke. Not because she needed to follow along. Because she wanted to read every word of it in real time, while it was actually happening, while she was actually there. She had been waiting for this room her whole life. She was going to be present for every second of it. Nora came to the ceremony. She stood at the back of the observer gallery, not credentialed for the floor, which had been her own choice. She had decided, when they were still 3 weeks out in the quarantine zone making final plans, that she did not want to be on the floor for this part. She wanted to see it the way most of humanity would see it, eventually, from above, from a distance, as something that had happened and could not be taken back. The chair that had been placed for Eli was the original one, retrieved from deep storage, where it had been sitting for 1,000 years in a sealed crate labeled inactive, human seat. It had been built for the original assembly founding, made to human proportions from 1,000 years ago. Assembly craftspeople had replaced the nameplate before the ceremony. The old one had been discarded. When Eli sat in it for the first time, there was a half-inch of height that was wrong. 1,000 years of different gravity, different nutrition, different everything had made the average human slightly taller. Not much. Enough. The discomfort was invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Vale Coram was paying close attention. He noticed the adjustment, the small, almost imperceptible shift in how Eli settled, and he said nothing. He filed it away. The chair would need to be replaced. He would see to that himself. The ceremony ended. The session chair announced the formal restoration of the human seat and asked the full chamber to record acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was logged. The chamber's systems updated. In databases across 63 inhabited systems, a status field that had read extinct for 1,000 years changed to one word. Active. The first vote of the newly restored human seat came 40 minutes later. It was a procedural vote, an amendment to deep space salvage law, specifically the rules around abandoned vessel classification in unmapped regions. It was not important in any dramatic sense. It was the kind of governance that holds everything together from underneath without anyone looking directly at it. The session chair called the amendment. Votes were collected in standard order. Eli voted. His vote was logged. It registered in the tally. It counted the same as every other vote. It was the first human vote in the Galactic Assembly in 1,000 years, and it was about salvage law, and it passed with 180 votes in favor, and the session moved on. Lena thought this was exactly right. She thought it was possibly the most human thing that could have happened. She did not say this out loud, but she thought it hard enough that Eli glanced at her from across the floor, and she looked away before he could read her face. After the session ended and the chamber began to empty, Vale Coram moved through the thinning crowd and found Eli near the edge of the floor. He reached into the document case he carried and removed a single sheet. Physical paper, old stock, the kind the assembly had used for official documents at the founding. It was yellowed at the edges and handled with the careful distance of something that had been touched very rarely. He held it out. Eli took it. It was the original motion. The one that had declared humanity extinct, 1,000 years ago. The full text, with every signatory, the date, the vote count. At the very bottom, in the margin, in handwriting so old that most translation systems could not parse the script, were 3 words in Vale Coram's native dialect. They will return. Eli looked at the paper for a long time. He looked at the handwriting. He looked up at Vale Coram. You kept this, he said. Someone had to, Vale Coram said. Eli folded the paper slowly, with the kind of care that means you are not planning to put it down somewhere and forget about it. He folded it and placed it inside his jacket, against his chest, where it would travel back to the ship with him, and back through the zone, and back home. Thank you, he said. Vale Coram looked at him for a moment. He thought about what to say and decided on nothing. He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the center of the chamber. Lena was waiting at the end of the corridor outside the main doors. Her eyes were slightly red and she had clearly been crying and was pretending with very little success that she had not been. Eli looked at her and said nothing about it. Nora came from the side corridor, quiet and direct, the way she always arrived, like she already knew where you were going and had simply taken the faster route. The three of them stood together outside the chamber. "Well," Lena said. "What now?" Eli turned and looked at the chamber doors. At the nameplate on the outer wall, restored that morning to what it used to say, 1,000 years ago. "Now we show up," he said. "Every session. Every vote. Every amendment about salvage law and trade routes and border protocols that nobody wants to sit through." He started walking. Nora fell into step beside him. Lena followed half a step behind, wiping her face with the back of her hand and looking at the ceiling like the ceiling owed her something. "We are very good at surviving," Eli said, as they walked. "Turns out that is the easy part." "What is the hard part?" Lena said. "Being here," he said. "Every time. Not just the big days. The regular ones." They kept walking. The station moved around them, full and bright and loud with the regular business of the galaxy going about itself. In the empty chamber behind them, Veilcorum stood alone for a while. He walked to the center of the floor, to the place where Eli had stood and read 40 minutes of charter language without looking at his notes. He stood in that spot and looked up at the tiered seats, empty now, the lights beginning to dim on the automated schedule. He walked to the chair. He looked at it. Measured it with his eye. Half an inch too short. He took out his small personal device and made a note: "Order new chair, human specifications, current standard, highest quality available." He filed the note. He looked at the chamber one more time. At the space it held. At the history sitting in its walls. He turned off the last lights manually, the old way, the way he had done it in every session for 400 years. He had been right about this for 1,000 years. It still did not feel like winning, exactly. It felt like the start of something that did not have a name yet, something that was going to take a long time and a great deal of regular, undramatic work. He decided that was fine. He had always been good at waiting. He went home.